Welcome back to Study Hall, where we like to take these deep dives,
Right.
into complex and intriguing subjects.
Yeah.
Stuff that makes you go, I need to understand this better.
Yeah.
So today we're tackling presidential pardons.
Oh, wow.
Specifically, the recent pardon of Andrew Zabavsky,
Okay.
granted by Donald Trump on January 22nd, 2025.
All right.
Now, I know what you're thinking, pardons.
Yeah.
Aren't those pretty standard?
Mhm.
Sure, they happen, but this one has sparked some serious debate
Okay.
and raised questions that go way beyond one man's freedom.
I see.
It's about the power of the presidency,
Right.
the meaning of justice,
Mhm.
and even the potential for political maneuvering.
Okay.
So to untangle all of this,
Yeah.
we're going straight to the source material,
Okay.
the actual pardon document itself,
Got it.
and a document that lays out the arguments for and against this pardon.
Okay.
We've got an expert with us today who can help us break it all down.
Absolutely.
So before we get into the pardon itself,
Oh.
can you give us the rundown on who Andrew Zabavsky is
Yeah.
and what landed him in this situation?
Well, to put it simply, Zabavsky was found guilty of violating sections 371 and 1512 of the United States Code.
Oh, okay.
So I know
there we go.
those numbers probably don't mean much to most people, so let's
Yeah.
break it down.
Yeah.
These sections deal with conspiracy and obstruction of justice.
Okay.
Pretty serious stuff.
Yeah.
And the result, he was sentenced to 48 months in prison for each count to be served concurrently.
Wow.
That's 4 years behind bars, plus 3 years of supervised release and a $200 special assessment.
Okay, so those charges sound pretty complex, violating sections 371 and 1512.
Right.
Could you break that down for us? What did he actually DO?
Sure. Section 371 refers to conspiracy to defraud the United States.
Okay.
Basically, it means 2 or more people agreed to obstruct lawful function of the government by deceit, craft, or trickery. Section 1512 deals with obstruction of justice
Right.
and covers a wide range of acts that interfere with a judicial proceeding. That could include things like tampering with evidence, intimidating witnesses, or influencing jurors.
Okay, got it. So that gives us the background on the offenses themselves.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned he was sentenced to 48 months.
Hmm.
Is that a typical sentence for these kinds of crimes?
That's a great question.
Does it lend itself to any of those arguments about excessive sentencing we see debated so often?
Sentencing guidelines for federal crimes are complex. They take into account things like the severity of the offense, the defendant's criminal history, and other factors.
Right.
4 years is certainly within the range of possible sentences for these charges.
Okay.
But whether it's typical or excessive depends on the specific details of the case. That's where things get really interesting. We don't know all those details.
Right. And that's part of what makes this whole pardon situation so intriguing. We're dealing with information gaps and having to interpret things based on what we do know.
Right.
So let's turn to what we do know.
Okay.
This pardon document.
Yeah.
It's dated January 22nd, 2025, and grants Zabavsky a full and unconditional pardon.
Wow.
That sounds pretty straightforward,
What?
but I'm guessing there's more to it than meets the eye.
You're absolutely right. Full and unconditional is doing a lot of work in that phrase.
Okay.
It means exactly what it says. All legal consequences of his conviction are completely gone.
Really?
It's as if the conviction never happened.
Hold on. This is blowing my mind.
Yeah.
So if a president really wanted to, could they just empty out the federal prisons?
Wow.
Are there any checks on this power?
That's the big question that's always debated.
Right.
The Constitution itself doesn't explicitly lay out any limits on the pardon power. It's granted to the president in Article 2, Section 2, Clause 1, and it's pretty broad.
Wow.
Basically, it gives the president the power to say, you're forgiven for any federal crime.
So wow.
And no one else can say no.
Wow, that's some serious power.
It is.
And this document really drives that point home.
Yeah.
It's signed by Donald Trump himself, using the full force of his presidential authority.
Right.
It even designates the pardon attorney as his representative.
Okay.
It all feels very official and, dare I say, a little intimidating.
It's definitely a reminder of the weight that a presidential pardon carries both historically and legally.
Right.
The language is formal. The legal citations are precise.
Yeah.
This isn't just a casual get-out-of-jail-free card. It's a carefully considered legal act with lasting consequences.
Okay, so now that we have a better understanding of the pardon itself,
Right.
let's get into the heart of the matter.
Okay.
The arguments for and against Zabavsky's pardon.
Right.
Our source document lays out some key points on both sides.
Yeah.
So let's tackle those one by one,
Okay.
starting with the arguments in favor of the pardon.
All right.
The first one listed is presidential prerogative. Essentially, it's the idea that the president has the right to use this power as they see fit.
Okay.
And it's not for anyone else to question.
This is where we start to see the tension between different interpretations of the Constitution and the power dynamics within our government.
Yeah.
The argument of presidential prerogative emphasizes the broad authority given to the president in Article 2.
Okay.
But it also raises questions about accountability and potential for abuse of power.
Right. It seems like a slippery slope.
Yeah.
Just because the president can do something, does that mean they always should?
Exactly. That's the debate that surrounds this pardon power.
Yeah.
And it's a debate that has been going on since the founding of our country.
Okay, so moving on to the next argument in favor of the pardon. Rehabilitation and redemption.
Okay.
The document suggests that this pardon could be seen as giving Zabavsky a chance to rebuild his life without the shadow of a criminal record hanging over him.
This argument taps into a fundamental value in our justice system.
Okay.
The idea that punishment shouldn't only be about retribution, but also about rehabilitation. The hope is that a pardon can help someone reintegrate into society and become a productive citizen.
This makes me think of that quote from, I'm trying to remember the source,
Yeah.
about how the purpose of punishment shouldn't be revenge,
Right.
but rather to help someone become a better person. Do you think that applies in Zabavsky's case?
That's a very interesting point. It raises the question of whether or not Zabavsky is genuinely remorseful for his actions. And if he's committed to rehabilitation, unfortunately, we can't know for sure what's in his heart.
Right. And that's where the public debate gets tricky.
Yeah.
We're often left to speculate about motives and intentions. But let's keep moving through these arguments. The next one is precedent setting.
Right.
The document suggests that this pardon could potentially pave the way for future pardons in cases where sentencing is seen as too harsh or even unjust.
This is where things get particularly interesting from a legal standpoint.
Okay.
A pardon by its nature establishes a precedent. It can be a powerful tool for changing the way justice is applied in our country.
But as with all powerful tools,
Right.
there's always the risk of misuse.
Absolutely. Establishing a precedent can be a double-edged sword.
Okay.
On one hand, it could lead to a more humane and equitable application of justice.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, it could open the door to pardons that erode public trust in the legal system.
That makes sense. It's all about context and the potential consequences.
Right.
Okay, the last argument in favor of the pardon is alleviating the burden on the prison system.
Okay.
The idea is that with fewer people in prison,
Yeah.
there's less strain on resources and taxpayer dollars.
This is a pragmatic argument that often comes up in discussions about criminal justice reform.
Right.
It highlights the very real costs associated with mass incarceration, both financially and socially.
It's a valid point.
Yeah.
But it also feels a bit cold, doesn't it? Like we're reducing human lives to budget line items.
That's a fair observation. It's important to remember that we're talking about real people's lives here, not just abstract concepts.
Okay, so we've explored the arguments for Zabavsky's pardon.
Right.
Let's take a deep breath and dive into the other side of the coin.
Okay.
The arguments against this pardon.
Right.
And I have a feeling this is where things get even more complicated.
You're not wrong. The arguments against this pardon tap into some very deep-seated concerns about fairness, accountability, and the rule of law.
Well, let's not keep our listeners in suspense.
Okay.
Hit us with the first argument against the pardon.
The most prominent argument against the pardon is the perception of favoritism.
Okay.
Essentially, the concern is that this pardon looks like special treatment, especially given Trump's history of pardoning individuals with personal or political connections.
This is starting to sound familiar.
Yeah.
Wasn't there a lot of talk about Trump showing favoritism with some of his other pardons?
There was.
Does this one fit that pattern?
That's a question a lot of people are asking. And it's a difficult one to answer definitively without more information.
Right.
But it's certainly a valid concern, given the potential for the pardon power to be used to shield allies from accountability.
Right. And that perception of favoritism can really erode public trust in the justice system.
Absolutely.
It starts to feel like there are two sets of rules, one for the powerful and connected, and another for everyone else.
Exactly. And that undermines the very foundation of a fair and impartial justice system.
Okay, so moving on to the next argument against the pardon, undermining the judicial process.
Okay.
The document highlights the concern that overturning a jury's verdict basically shows disrespect for the entire legal process.
Right.
that led to that conviction.
This argument gets to the core of the separation of powers in our government.
Okay.
The judiciary is a separate branch, and its decisions, especially jury verdicts, shouldn't be lightly overturned.
Right.
A pardon can be seen as an executive intrusion into the judicial realm.
Yeah.
And that can have long-term consequences.
It's like saying, hey, judges and juries, we don't really care what you decided.
Right.
We're going to do things our own way.
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
And that can send a dangerous message about the balance of power and the rule of law.
Okay, next on the list is public backlash, which seems pretty self-explanatory.
Yeah.
People are angry, and pardons, especially controversial ones, tend to stir up strong emotions.
Public perception matters, especially in a democracy.
Right.
If a significant portion of the population views a pardon as unjust or politically motivated, it can damage the president's credibility.
Yeah.
And even lead to calls for impeachment or other forms of accountability.
It's a reminder that the president isn't operating in a vacuum.
Right.
Their actions have consequences, and those consequences can include public outrage and demands for accountability.
Absolutely. The pardon power isn't just a legal tool, it's a political tool as well.
Okay, and lastly, we have the argument of risk to public trust.
Right.
The document suggests that pardoning someone convicted of serious crimes, like obstruction of justice in Zabavsky's case, sends the message that those crimes aren't really that big of a deal.
This argument gets to the core of deterrence and accountability.
Yeah.
If people believe they can get away with serious offenses, especially if they have the right connections, it can embolden criminal behavior and erode the rule of law.
It's not just about one man's freedom.
Right.
It's about the potential impact on society as a whole.
Precisely. A pardon can't be viewed in isolation.
Right.
It has ripple effects that extend far beyond the individual being pardoned.
Wow. We've covered a lot of ground here. And it's clear that this pardon is anything but simple.
Yeah.
Every argument seems to have a counter-argument, and it's hard to know where to land.
It's a complex issue.
What stands out to you as the most compelling points on either side?
That's a great question, and one that I think everyone needs to grapple with individually. For me, the most striking aspect of this case is the tension between competing values, justice versus mercy, accountability versus second chances, individual rights versus the common good.
Yeah, and finding that balance is incredibly difficult.
It is.
It's not about finding the right answer, but rather about understanding the complexities and engaging in thoughtful dialogue.
Right.
So before we jump into the political landscape surrounding this pardon and what it all might mean for Zabavsky's future, let's take a moment to let everything we've discussed so far sink in.
Yeah.
There's a lot to unpack here, and it's important to give ourselves time to process it all.
Absolutely.
Welcome back to Study Hall. We've been diving deep into the pardon of Andrew Zabavsky, exploring the arguments for and against it, and as we've seen, there's a lot to unpack.
Right.
But now we need to shift our focus to the political landscape surrounding this pardon, because let's be honest, it's impossible to ignore the elephant in the room. The fact that this pardon was granted by Donald Trump, a figure known for stirring up controversy.
Right, and that context adds a whole new layer of complexity.
To truly understand the implications of this pardon, we need to consider Trump's track record with pardons. How does this case fit or perhaps deviate from his previous use of clemency powers?
You know, some people are already drawing comparisons to the pardon of Joe Arpaio back in 2017.
Oh, yeah.
Arpaio was a controversial sheriff.
Right.
Convicted of criminal contempt of court for defying a court order to stop racial profiling. Trump's pardon of Arpaio was widely seen as undermining the judicial process and sending a message that he was above the law. Do you see any parallels between the Arpaio pardon and the Zabavsky pardon?
There are definitely some interesting parallels there. Both cases involve individuals convicted of offenses that could be seen as challenging the authority of the judicial system. And both pardons were granted by Trump, who has shown a willingness to use his pardon power to intervene in cases that align with his political agenda.
So for those of us who might not be as familiar with Trump's pardon history,
can you give us a quick rundown? Was he known for granting a lot of pardons?
He issued over 140 pardons and commutations during his presidency.
Wow, that's a lot.
Many of those were seen as highly controversial, often benefiting individuals with personal or political ties to him.
So it sounds like the perception of favoritism argument we discussed earlier really comes into play here.
Absolutely. Several of Trump's pardons sparked accusations of cronyism.
Yeah.
They raised concerns about whether he was using the pardon power to reward loyalty or shield allies from accountability.
Okay, so knowing that background, how does Zabavsky's pardon fit into this picture? Was it a typical Trump pardon, or was there something unique about this case?
That's a question that legal scholars and political analysts will likely be debating for some time.
Yeah.
On the surface, it might seem to align with some of Trump's previous pardons, given that Zabavsky was convicted of offenses related to actions that could be perceived as benefiting Trump politically.
Right, because his convictions stemmed from those charges related to conspiracy and obstruction of justice. So some people might see this as Trump trying to protect himself or those close to him.
Precisely. That's certainly a narrative that some will push.
Yeah.
However, it's important to note that we don't have any concrete evidence to suggest that Zabavsky's actions were directly connected to Trump himself.
Okay.
Or that the pardon was a quid pro quo.
Wait, quid pro quo. I've heard that phrase thrown around a lot lately, but can you remind us what it means?
Of course. Quid pro quo is a Latin phrase that basically means something for something.
Mm-hmm.
It suggests an exchange of favors or benefits.
Right.
In this context, it would imply that Trump pardoned Zabavsky in exchange for something Zabavsky did to benefit him.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So while we can speculate about the motivations behind this pardon, we need to be careful not to jump to conclusions without solid evidence.
Exactly. It's important to separate fact from speculation and to avoid making assumptions without sufficient evidence to support them.
But it's still fair to say that the potential for political motivation is definitely there. And it's something that will likely be scrutinized very closely.
Absolutely. This pardon is almost guaranteed to face intense public and legal scrutiny, given the potential for controversy and the questions it raises about the motivations behind it.
Right.
We may see legal challenges, congressional investigations, and even calls for impeachment, depending on how things unfold.
It's like that old saying, no good deed goes unpunished.
Right.
Even when a pardon is meant to be merciful, can stir up a whole lot of trouble.
That's a very apt analogy. Pardons, especially those granted in politically charged contexts, are rarely simple acts of mercy. They often have far-reaching consequences and can ignite fierce debates about justice, accountability, and the limits of executive power.
And that brings us to Zabavsky himself.
Yeah.
What happens to him now that he's been pardoned?
Right.
Does he just walk free and resume his life as if nothing happened?
Legally speaking, yes. The pardon expunges his criminal record.
Yeah.
That means it's wiped clean as if the conviction never happened. He's no longer subject to imprisonment, supervised release, or any other penalties stemming from his conviction.
So in theory, he could even run for public office if he wanted to.
That's right.
There's nothing legally stopping him.
The pardon removes all legal barriers that would have otherwise prevented him from holding certain positions or engaging in certain activities.
Wow. It's a pretty clean slate, legally speaking.
Mm-hmm.
But, as you alluded to earlier, the social and reputational consequences might linger.
Right.
It's not like people will suddenly forget that he was convicted of these serious charges.
Exactly. A pardon can't erase memories or change public perception.
Right.
Zabavsky may still face social stigma, difficulty finding employment, and skepticism from those who believe he should have been held accountable for his actions. He might even become a target for protests or other forms of public disapproval.
It's a reminder that while a pardon addresses the legal ramifications of a crime, it can't fully restore someone's reputation or erase the past.
It's a complex and nuanced situation with no easy answers. The impact of this pardon on Zabavsky's life will likely unfold in the coming months and years, and it will be interesting to see how he navigates the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead.
It almost feels like this pardon is just the beginning of another chapter in this story, not the end.
Yeah.
And it's a story that has the potential to teach us a lot about ourselves, our values, and the institutions that govern our society. Welcome back to Study Hall. We've been on quite a journey today, haven't we?
We have.
From the specifics of Andrew Zabavsky's case to the broader implications of presidential pardons, we've covered a lot of ground.
We've delved into the legal intricacies, dissected the arguments for and against this pardon, and explored the political undercurrents that make this case so fascinating.
And through it all, one thing has become crystal clear. This isn't just about one man's freedom.
Right.
This pardon raises fundamental questions about power, justice, and accountability in our society.
Questions that have no easy answers and will likely continue to spark debate and discussion for years to come. It's a reminder that the decisions made by those in power have ripple effects that extend far beyond the immediate situation.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's take a moment to recap the key takeaways. First, we saw how the pardon power, while rooted in the Constitution, is a double-edged sword.
Right.
It can be a tool for mercy and justice, but it can also be used to circumvent accountability and undermine the rule of law.
We also saw how the political context surrounding a pardon can significantly influence public perception and shape the debate about its legitimacy. And in Zabavsky's case, the fact that it was granted by Donald Trump, known for his controversial use of clemency powers, adds another layer of complexity to the analysis.
We then explored the practical implications for Zabavsky himself, acknowledging that while a pardon erases his legal consequences, it cannot erase the past or the potential social stigma that might follow him.
And perhaps most importantly, we saw how this case highlights the enduring tensions between competing values in our society. Justice versus mercy, accountability versus second chances, individual rights versus the common good.
So what have we learned from all this? I'm starting to see that pardons aren't just about legalities. They force us to confront some really tough questions about what we value as a society. Where do we draw the line between justice and mercy? When does someone deserve a second chance? And how do we ensure that the pardon power is used responsibly and ethically?
Those are excellent questions, and I don't think there are easy answers. It's a constant balancing act, weighing competing interests and trying to uphold the principles of justice and fairness.
Now, I'm going to put you in the hot seat for a minute. If you were president, what would be your guiding principles for granting a pardon? Tough call, right?
It definitely is. For me, it would come down to a few key factors. First, is there evidence of genuine remorse and a commitment to rehabilitation? Second, would the pardon serve a greater good, such as righting a historical injustice or promoting reconciliation? And third, would the pardon undermine public trust in the justice system or create a perception of favoritism?
That's a thoughtful framework. It seems like you'd be approaching the pardon power with a lot of caution and consideration for the potential consequences.
I think that's essential. The pardon power is an extraordinary privilege, and it should be wielded with great care and discernment.
Well said. I think this deep dive has given us all a lot to think about. It's a reminder that even in a system as complex as ours, the decisions of those in power have a real impact on people's lives. And it's up to us as citizens to stay informed, engage in these discussions, and hold our leaders accountable.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power, and by understanding the complexities of issues like presidential pardons, we can become more informed and engaged citizens.
Thanks for joining us in Study Hall today. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a fascinating and thought-provoking topic. Until then, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.